Blood is supposedly thicker than water, but in my family, ego always drowned out everything else. I spent 4 years operating in the darkest shadows with a covert military unit, taking bullets and losing brothers. While my family thought I was just a glorified logistics secretary, I didn't care what they thought until my arrogant cousin pushed me too far at our annual summer barbecue. He wanted to humiliate me. Instead, he woke up a ghost and forced his own father, a retired Navy SEAL, to drop the hammer. The smell of hickory smoke and charred meat drifted over the manicured lawns of Lake Tahoe. It was the 4th of July, and the Hayes family was engaged in their favorite annual tradition, pretending we all liked each other. I sat in a cedar Adirondack chair, a half-empty bottle of sparkling water sweating in my right hand. Behind my dark aviators, I was scanning the perimeter, a habit deeply ingrained and impossible to break. 2 exits through the main house, a clear path to the docks, and the tree line to the north offered the best concealment if things went loud. Stop it, Sarah. I reprimanded myself internally. You're at a family barbecue. Nobody is going to initiate contact here. It was hard to turn off. Just 72 hours ago, I had been breathing in the suffocating, dust-choked air of a nameless valley in the Horn of Africa. My boots had been caked in mud and worse, my ears ringing from the deafening stutter of a DSHK heavy machine gun that had pinned my team behind a crumbling mud brick wall for 6 agonizing hours. Now, I was surrounded by women in expensive sundresses and men in pastel polo shirts arguing over the prime interest rate. The contrast was enough to induce a unique kind of vertigo. Underneath my loose-fitting linen shirt, my left rib cage throbbed with a dull, insistent ache, a souvenir from a close-quarters extraction that had gone completely sideways. The Kevlar had stopped the fragmentation from the blast, but the kinetic impact had cracked 2 ribs. I had popped 4 ibuprofen in the car ride up, masking the wince every time I breathed too deeply. Earth to Sarah. Hey, logistics queen. The loud, braying voice shattered my momentary peace. I didn't have to turn my head to know who it was. My cousin, Brett. Brett was 32, 2 years older than me, and possessed the kind of unearned confidence that only came from a trust fund and a degree in finance he barely scraped by to get. He worked as a senior wealth manager at some boutique firm in San Francisco, though from what I could tell, his primary job was posting photos of his leased Porsche 911 and complaining about capital gains taxes. He strolled across the deck, flanked by 2 of his equally insufferable frat brother colleagues he had invited up for the weekend. Brett was holding a plastic red cup filled to the brim with craft beer, wearing boat shoes without socks, and a smirk that made my trigger finger instinctively twitch. "Hey, Brett," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. The golden rule of being an undercover operative in your own family was simple. Be boring. Be utterly, forgettably mundane. "How's the glamorous life of a military supply clerk?" Brett asked, coming to a halt in front of my chair. He looked back at his friends, chuckling. "Guys, this is my little cousin Sarah. She bravely guards the paper clips for the army, making sure the ink cartridges don't fall into enemy hands." His friends snickered dutifully. "It's logistics." "Brett," I replied, reciting my well-worn cover story with the practiced dullness of a broken metronome. "Supply chain management for European bases. It's a lot of spreadsheets and customs declaration forms, but it pays the bills." In reality, I was a captain in the United States Army's intelligence support activity, often referred to simply as the activity. We were the ghosts who paved the way for the Tier 1 operators. We went in first, in civilian clothes, operating without a safety net in hostile territory to gather human and signals intelligence. If I were caught, the government would deny I ever existed. My family thought I sat in a cubicle in Stuttgart ordering boots and Kevlar vests. "Spreadsheets." "Right," Brett sneered, taking a loud gulp of his beer. "I mean, it's cool you found something that suits you. Not everyone is cut out for the high-stakes stuff. You know, I just closed a $12 million merger last week." Let me tell you, the boardroom is an absolute war zone. Blood on the floor, metaphorically speaking. You have to be a killer to survive in my world. I took a slow sip of my water, letting the cold liquid soothe my dry throat. A war zone. I thought about Staff Sergeant Jenkins, bleeding out in the back of a blacked-out Hilux while I desperately packed his femoral artery with combat gauze, my hands slick with his blood as RPGs tore through the night sky. I'm sure it gets very stressful, Brett, I said softly. Oh, you have no idea. He pressed on, oblivious to the total lack of engagement on my end. It's psychological warfare. You have to anticipate the enemy's moves. It's basically exactly what my dad did, just with higher financial stakes and better suits. My eyes flicked past Brett to the massive, custom-built stone grill on the patio. Standing there, expertly flipping a row of ribeyes, was Brett's father, my Uncle Rick. Richard Hayes was a towering figure in our family, both literally and figuratively. He was a retired Navy SEAL, a Master Chief who had spent 24 years in the teams. He had the quintessential operator look that never quite faded, thick shoulders, a quiet, predatory grace, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He wore his history silently. There were no boastful bumper stickers on his truck, no loud stories at family gatherings, just a quiet, unshakable aura of a man who had seen the elephant and survived. Brett worshipped him, but he fundamentally misunderstood him. Brett thought being a warrior was about being loud, dominant, and crushing your opposition in public. Uncle Rick knew that true lethality was quiet. I watched Uncle Rick as Brett continued to boast. The older man didn't look up from the grill, but I saw the subtle tightening of his jaw. He heard every word. Anyway, Brett said, gesturing to my outfit, a simple pair of dark jeans and a gray hoodie to hide the bandages on my ribs. You should really get out of the government teat. Sarah, come work in the private sector. My firm is looking for administrative assistants. The pay is double what the Army gives you to count staples, and you wouldn't have to wear those ugly combat boots. I'll keep that in mind. Brett, thank you, I said, offering a tight, polite smile. I watched him swagger away with his sycophants, their laughter trailing behind them like toxic exhaust. I let out a long, slow breath, closing my eyes and forcing the tension out of my shoulders. The throbbing in my ribs flared up again. Just get through the weekend, I told myself. Eat a burger, watch the fireworks, and go back to base. 48 hours. You've survived worse. But as I opened my eyes and looked over at the grill, I found Uncle Rick staring directly at me. His gaze was heavy, calculating. He wasn't looking at my face. His eyes dropped to the way I was holding my left arm tight against my body, guarding my ribs. Then he looked at the exact placement of my chair against the solid oak tree, maximizing my field of view. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod before returning to the stakes. A cold prickle of adrenaline washed over the back of my neck. Uncle Rick was sharp. I needed to be careful, or my carefully constructed house of cards was going to collapse right here at the family barbecue. As the afternoon bled into early evening, the California sun began to dip toward the lake, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn. The alcohol had been flowing freely for hours, and the volume of the gathering had risen exponentially. I had retreated to a quiet corner of the expansive wraparound porch, trying to blend in with the potted ferns. I had managed to successfully navigate a conversation with my Aunt Susan about her new golden retriever, and gracefully dodged my mother's probing questions about why I didn't have a boyfriend yet. It's hard to date when you're managing supply manifests in different time zones. Mom, I had lied smoothly. Now, I was just trying to run down the clock. I held a plate with a half-eaten burger, my appetite non-existent. The phantom smells of the deployment, cordite, raw sewage, and copper, kept overriding the scent of barbecue sauce. I was exhausted, the kind of deep, cellular fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. Unfortunately, Brett's radar for vulnerability was finely tuned. He stumbled out onto the porch, his face flushed red from the sun and a steady intake of tequila. His two friends, a guy named Chad and another named Tyler, were hot on his heels. They were deep into a loud, obnoxious debate about the stock market when Brett spotted me. "There she is," Brett crowed, leaning heavily against the wooden railing. "The military's top pencil pusher. What are you doing hiding over here in the dark? Sarah, planning a tactical raid on the potato salad?" Chad and Tyler erupted into loud, frat boy laughter. I forced a neutral expression. "Just enjoying the view. Brett, it's a beautiful evening." "Yeah, well, enjoy it while you can," Brett said, taking a sloppy step closer. "I hear the government is looking to slash defense budgets. You know, cut the dead weight, the non-essential personnel. You better hope your spreadsheet skills transfer to a civilian temp agency." "I think my job is secure for now," I replied softly. "You know what your problem is, Sarah?" Brett slurred, pointing a finger at me. "You lack ambition. You took the easy way out. The military is a great safety net for people who can't hack it in the real world. Free healthcare, guaranteed paycheck, housing allowance. It's basically a socialist welfare program for people who like wearing camo." My grip on my paper plate tightened. I could feel the plastic rim beginning to crack under my thumb. The sheer disrespect, not just to me, but to the men and women I served with, the men and women who had died in the dirt so this spoiled brat could day trade crypto on his iPhone, burned like battery acid in my chest. "I wouldn't call it an easy way out," I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing the light, bubbly tone of my cover persona. It was the voice I used on the radio when calling in close air support. Calm, flat, dangerous. Brett didn't notice the shift. "Oh, please. Don't try to act tough. You're not exactly kicking down doors. You're ordering toilet paper. My dad, now he was a real warrior. He was a Navy SEAL." He puffed out his chest, appropriating Uncle Rick's valor like it was a hand-me-down jacket. "He did the real wet work, the stuff that takes actual guts, not like the modern military, letting women in to fill diversity quotas." Tyler chimed in, a smirk playing on his lips. "Yeah, I read an article about that, lowering the physical standards so everyone gets a participation trophy." I stood up, slowly. The movement pulled at my cracked ribs, but I ignored the pain. I was 5'9", athletic, and while I didn't have the hulking mass of an infantry grunt, my body was forged by years of grueling, relentless rucking and combat conditioning. I stepped into Brett's personal space. "Brett," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, forcing him to lean in to hear me. "You don't know the first thing about the military, about standards, or about what it takes to survive outside your gated community. Do us both a favor and stick to talking about hedge funds." Brett's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, momentarily taken aback by my sudden proximity and the ice in my eyes. But his bruised ego, fueled by alcohol, quickly overrode his survival instinct. "Are you threatening me? Logistics?" he sneered, puffing his chest out to try and intimidate me. He was taller, but his center of gravity was high, his balance sloppy. I could have swept his leg, dropped him on the hardwood deck, and dislocated his shoulder before his brain registered he was falling. "Hey." The single syllable cut through the humid summer air like a whip. We both turned. Uncle Rick was standing at the sliding glass door. He had a pair of stainless steel grilling tongs in one hand, but he held them down at his side like a baton. His face was completely impassive, but his eyes were locked onto Brett. The relaxed, jovial uncle from an hour ago was gone. "Is there a problem here, Brett?" Uncle Rick asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that instantly silenced Chad and Tyler. Brett swallowed hard, his bravado evaporating under his father's gaze. "No. Dad, no problem. Just giving Sarah a hard time. You know how it is. Family banter." Uncle Rick's eyes shifted to me. He looked at my posture, squared off, balanced on the balls of my feet, hands open but ready at my sides. It was a fighter's stance, instinctual and undeniable. I quickly relaxed, shifting my weight to one leg and trying to look awkward. It was too late. Banter, Uncle Rick repeated flatly. Right. Take your friends down to the dock. Brett, the fireworks start in 30 minutes. It was a suggestion disguised as an absolute order. Brett nodded nervously, mumbling a, yeah, sure, before signaling his friends to follow him. They practically scurried away. Uncle Rick stayed by the door. He didn't say a word to me. He just watched me for a long, uncomfortable moment. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken questions. I felt exposed, like a spotlight had just been snapped on in a pitch-black room. He gave me one slow, deliberate nod, then turned and walked back into the house. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I needed to leave. I needed to pack my duffel bag, fake a stomach bug, and drive back to my safe house in Nevada. The walls were closing in, and I could feel the carefully constructed walls of my double life beginning to collapse right here at the family barbecue. Before I could move, the sharp, vibrating buzz of my phone shattered my thoughts. Not my personal iPhone, the heavy, matte black, heavily encrypted satellite device I kept hidden in the inner pocket of my jacket. My blood ran cold. That phone was on a secure JSOC network. It was my direct lifeline to the Tactical Operations Center. I was strictly off duty, officially on a mandatory 72-hour decompression leave. That phone did not ring unless the world was ending. I practically sprinted off the porch, slipping through the side door and rushing down the hallway toward Uncle Rick's study. It was the furthest room from the noise of the barbecue, insulated by thick oak doors and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. I pulled the heavy device from my jacket. The screen was glowing with a harsh red light, displaying a string of encrypted alphanumeric codes instead of a caller ID. I ducked into the dark study, pushed the door nearly shut, leaving it cracked just a fraction so the latch wouldn't click loudly, and pressed the green acceptance icon. I brought the receiver to my ear. Omen 6, this is Overlord. A gruff, synthesized voice crackled through the earpiece. The voice was distorted by heavy encryption, but I recognized the cadence of the night shift watch officer at Fort Liberty. Overlord, this is Omen 6, I replied, my voice dropping back into the cold, clinical rhythm of the mission. I am off-grid. Code yellow. Status? Omen 6, we have a flash traffic emergency. Authentication, Romeo Tango Niner 7. I closed my eyes, my brain instantly retrieving the daily cipher. I authenticate Charlie Whiskey. Go ahead, Overlord. We have a compromised exfil Omen 6. Vanguard 2-1 is pinned down grid sector Delta Niner in the valley. They are taking heavy contact from hostile elements. The intel package you provided prior to exfil seems to have a fatal gap. They are using the subterranean tunnels you marked as collapsed. A wave of nausea hit me, entirely unrelated to my ribs. Vanguard 2-1. That was the Tier 1 assault team I had spent 3 weeks doing reconnaissance for. I had crawled through the dirt to map that compound. If they were pinned down because of my intel, men were going to die. My friends were going to die. Overlord, negative, I hissed, pacing the floor of the study. Those tunnels were flooded and collapsed with thermobarics. I confirmed it visually. They must have breached a secondary network. Pull the thermal satellite imaging from... Suddenly, the heavy oak door to the study swung wide open. Well, who are we hiding from? Sarah? It was Brett. He was holding a fresh bottle of bourbon and a glass, looking immensely pleased with himself. He must have followed me from the porch, eager to continue his torment away from his father's watchful eyes. I spun around, horror flushing through my veins. Brett, get out. I'm on a work call. A work call on a holiday? Brett laughed loudly, his slurred voice echoing in the quiet study. Let me guess. Did the Stuttgart base run out of printer paper? Do you need to authorize a resupply of blue pens? He lunged forward with surprising speed, his drunken clumsiness masking his intent. Before I could pivot away, he reached out and snatched the heavy black phone from my hand. "Let's see who the logistics queen is talking to," he mocked. "Brett, no!" I lunged for it, but the sudden movement caused my cracked ribs to scream in agony. I gasped, faltering for a crucial half-second. Brett, laughing maniacally, pressed the speaker button. The silence in the study was instantly shattered by the frantic, chaotic audio of a live firefight bleeding through the secure connection. The harsh, staccato crack, crack, crack of AK-47 fire, the booming thud of a heavy machine gun, and the frantic screaming of men in combat filled the room. Omen 6! Omen 6! We need an immediate sit-rep on the secondary access points. The voice of the watch officer roared through the speaker, no longer synthesized, but raw and desperate. Vanguard is taking casualties. We have a bird on standby for dust-off, but the LZ is too hot. We need your ground truth assessment right fucking now, Captain. Brett froze. The smirk completely vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of pale, uncomprehending shock. The bourbon bottle in his hand tipped slightly, spilling amber liquid onto Uncle Rick's Persian rug. "What? What is this?" Brett stammered, staring at the phone like it was a live grenade. "Is this a video game? What kind of LARPing bullshit?" "Give me the goddamn phone, Brett," I snarled, stepping forward, the pain in my ribs forgotten. I wasn't his little cousin anymore. I was Captain Hayes, and my men were dying. Before I could grab the device, a shadow fell over the doorway. Uncle Rick stood there. He had come down the hall to fetch the very bottle of bourbon Brett was holding. He stepped into the room. He didn't look at Brett. He didn't look at me. His eyes were locked onto the black satellite phone in Brett's trembling hand. "Omen 6, do you copy? Captain Hayes, authenticate. If we don't get those coordinates, Vanguard 2-1 is going to be overrun in 4 mics." Uncle Rick's face transformed. The relaxed, middle-aged dad vanished entirely. The transformation was terrifying. His posture straightened, his eyes turned into chips of blue ice, and the sheer, overwhelming presence of a veteran Tier 1 operator filled the room, suffocating everything else. He recognized the tone of the watch officer. He recognized the phonetic call signs. He recognized the distinct, horrifying sound of real, desperate combat coming through a piece of encrypted military hardware. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The pieces clicked together behind his eyes in a fraction of a second. The way I sat, the way I scanned rooms, the fake, boring cover story. He knew exactly what I was. Then, Uncle Rick turned his gaze to his son. Brett was trembling, holding the phone out loosely. "Dad, I think Sarah is playing a joke." Uncle Rick stepped into Brett's space, backing his son against the heavy oak bookshelf. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't have to. The quiet, deadly intensity radiating off him was enough to make Brett look like he was going to wet himself. "You arrogant, pathetic little boy," Uncle Rick whispered, his voice vibrating with barely contained fury. "You have been mocking her all day. You have been insulting a woman who does things in the dark that would make you beg for your mother. Dad, I'm sorry. I thought she was just a..." "Shut your mouth," Uncle Rick commanded. "You play with Monopoly money. She plays with human lives. You are not worthy to carry her boots." I finished feeding the exfil route to the talk. "Overlord, confirm receipt. Godspeed to Vanguard. Omen 6, going dark." I ended the connection and slipped the phone back into my jacket. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by Brett's ragged breathing. Uncle Rick looked at me, a profound mixture of immense pride and deep sorrow in his eyes. He knew the burden I was carrying because he had carried it himself for decades. Then, he looked back at Brett, pointing a thick, scarred finger directly at his son's chest. "Apologize," Uncle Rick said, his voice colder than the deep ocean. "Now." The silence in Uncle Rick's study was suffocating, heavy with the metallic tang of spilled bourbon and unspoken truths. Brett was pressed against the oak bookshelf, his face drained of all color, his eyes darting frantically between his father's frozen, furious expression and the matte black satellite phone in my hand. "Apologize," Uncle Rick repeated. The word didn't echo. It seemed to absorb all the air in the room. Brett swallowed, a pathetic, dry sound. He looked at me, and for the first time in his 32 years of privileged existence, the arrogance was completely stripped away. He looked like a frightened child realizing he had wandered into the deep end of the ocean and couldn't touch the bottom. Sarah, I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. I didn't know." "You didn't know because you don't possess the capacity to see beyond your own reflection. Brett," Uncle Rick said coldly, "you mock what you don't understand. You measure a person's worth by their leased sports cars and their stock portfolios because you are empty inside." "Dad, please, get out of my sight," Uncle Rick ordered, cutting him off with the surgical precision of a sniper's bullet. "Go back out there. Keep your mouth shut. If I hear one more word out of you tonight, I will personally throw you off the end of that dock. Move." Brett didn't hesitate. He practically scrambled past us, giving me a wide berth as if I were radioactive, and slipped out the door. The latch clicked shut behind him, sealing us in the quiet sanctuary of the study. I let out a slow, ragged breath, leaning against the edge of the mahogany desk. The adrenaline spike was receding, leaving behind a cold, shivering exhaustion. My ribs throbbed with a renewed, vicious intensity, and I unconsciously wrapped my left arm tightly across my torso. Uncle Rick watched me for a long moment. He bent down, righted the bottle of bourbon Brett had dropped, and walked over to a crystal tray holding several heavy rocks glasses. He poured 2 fingers of the amber liquid into 2 glasses. He didn't ask if I wanted one. He walked over and pressed the cold glass into my right hand. "Drink," he said softly. I lifted the glass and took a sip. The bourbon burned all the way down, a searing heat that momentarily distracted from the ache in my chest. "Task Force Orange?" he asked quietly, leaning against the edge of the desk next to me. I closed my eyes. There was no point in lying anymore. Not to him. The camouflage had been burned away. ISA, I confirmed, using the acronym for the Intelligence Support Activity. "I'm a troop commander." Uncle Rick nodded slowly, staring down at his glass. "I suspected. You came home from your first logistics deployment 3 years ago with the 1,000-yard stare. You sit facing the doors. You clear rooms with your eyes before you enter them. And you guard your left side like you're hiding a fractured rib." I winced, a humorless smile touching my lips. "Cracked, 2 of them. Close quarters extraction went loud in Djibouti last week. You should be resting, Sarah." "I was trying to," I said, looking up at him. "But the world doesn't stop spinning just because I need a nap." I paused, the weight of the last 10 minutes pressing down on me. "Uncle Rick, I'm sorry about Brett. I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want the family to know." "Don't you dare apologize for my son's ignorance," Rick said, his voice hardening again. He reached out and placed a heavy, calloused hand on my shoulder. The grip was firm, grounding. "I spent 24 years in the teams. I know the burden of the shadow war. I know what it means to sit at a dinner table with people complaining about cold soup while you're trying to wash the smell of copper out of your nose." He clinked his glass against mine. "To the ghosts," he whispered. "To the ghosts," I echoed, finishing the bourbon in one long swallow. When we finally walked back out onto the wraparound porch, the atmosphere had shifted. The sun was fully below the tree line now, painting the sky over Lake Tahoe in bruised shades of purple and charcoal. The string lights crisscrossing the deck cast a warm, deceptive glow over the gathering. I immediately located Brett. He was huddled by the outdoor fire pit with Chad and Tyler. He was clutching a fresh beer, his posture rigid, speaking to them in hushed, urgent tones. He shot a paranoid glance in my direction as the sliding glass door shut behind us, quickly averting his eyes when Uncle Rick stepped out. "Go sit down, Sarah," Rick murmured. "I've got the steaks. Try to relax." I nodded and made my way back to my cedar Adirondack chair by the edge of the deck. I pulled my gray hoodie tighter around myself against the evening chill. I pulled out my civilian iPhone, sending a secure text to my TA contact to confirm Vanguard 2-1 had made it to the extraction bird. 3 minutes later, a single green checkmark appeared on my screen. They were safe. The intel had worked. I leaned my head back against the wood, closing my eyes. But peace was a luxury I couldn't afford tonight. The hornet's nest had been kicked, and Brett was doing damage control. Through the hum of casual conversation and the soft rock playing from the outdoor speakers, my trained ears easily picked up the whispers coming from the fire pit. "Swear to God, bro. It was just a simulation," Brett was saying, his voice slurring slightly. He was drinking fast, trying to drown the humiliation his father had handed him. "She's in logistics. They do these big war game exercises. It's basically just high-level IT support." She patched a training audio feed through her phone to try and scare me. "Are you serious?" Tyler scoffed. "She went through all that trouble just to mess with you?" "She's insecure, man," Brett rationalized, his ego desperately trying to rebuild its shattered foundation. "She knows she's a pencil pusher. She wants to feel important. My dad just played along because he felt bad for her. You know how he is. He supports all the troops, even the desk jockeys." I didn't move a muscle, keeping my eyes closed and my breathing even, pretending to be asleep. It was almost laughable. Brett's cognitive dissonance was so strong it was altering his reality. He couldn't accept that the cousin he had belittled for years was operating on a level he couldn't even fathom. So he invented a fiction to protect his fragile masculinity. Let him think it. I decided it was better for my cover anyway. Tomorrow, I would pack up, drive away, and let them all go back to their comfortable illusions. "Hey, the cavalry has arrived!" My Aunt Susan's voice rang out from the front of the house, followed by the heavy thud of footsteps on the wooden deck. I opened my eyes and looked toward the entryway. Uncle Rick had just dropped his tongs and was walking briskly toward a man who had just stepped onto the patio. "Mac, you ugly son of a bitch!" Rick boomed, wrapping the newcomer in a massive bear hug. The man, Mac, let out a deep, rumbling laugh that sounded like rocks in a cement mixer. "Good to see you too. Ricky, sorry I'm late. Traffic out of San Francisco was a nightmare." I assessed the new arrival instantly. Thomas Mac McAllister. He was in his late 40s, built like a brick outhouse, with a thick salt and pepper beard and arms covered in faded, unrecognizable tribal tattoos. He was wearing jeans and a black t-shirt that stretched tightly across his chest. He was missing the top half of his left pinky finger. My heart did a slow, heavy thump against my ribs. I knew Mac, not personally, but I knew his face. He was a legend in the Joint Special Operations Command community. He had spent 15 years at Naval Special Warfare Development Group, SEAL Team 6, before transitioning to a highly classified paramilitary role at the CIA's Special Activities Center. More importantly, I had briefed him 2 years ago in a windowless SCYF, Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility at Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan. I had stood in front of a whiteboard detailing a high-value target's movement patterns. I had been wearing sterile fatigues, no name tapes, no rank, just a ghost in the machine. Mac had sat in the front row, his piercing blue eyes analyzing every piece of intel I provided. He had trusted my intelligence to lead his assault force into a hostile valley. He hadn't known my name then. He only knew my operational alias. If he recognized me now, at a family barbecue, my cover wouldn't just be cracked, it would be shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. I slouched lower in my chair, pulling the hood of my sweatshirt up slightly, trying to blend into the shadows cast by the oak tree. "Everyone, this is Mac," Uncle Rick announced to the family scattered across the deck. "Best damn sniper I ever had the privilege of working with. Try not to bore him to death." Polite murmurs and greetings echoed around the patio. My mother waved enthusiastically. Brett, seeing a new audience and a real warrior to align himself with, practically leaped up from the fire pit. "Mac, great to meet you, sir," Brett said, thrusting his hand out. "Brett Hayes, Rick's son." Mac took his hand, his grip likely bone-crushing, though his expression remained pleasant. "Good to meet you, Brett. Your dad's told me a lot about you." "Only the good stuff, I hope." Brett chuckled smoothly. "Come on, let me get you a beer. You must be parched." Brett played the gracious host, fetching a craft IPA and leading Mac toward the center of the patio, right into the light. I kept my face turned toward the lake, watching them out of my peripheral vision. "So, Mac, what do you do now that you're out of the teams?" Brett asked loudly, ensuring his friends and the rest of the family could hear. "Private consulting," Mac said, taking a sip of his beer. "The universal cover for government contractors doing things the government couldn't officially do." "Right on," Brett said. "I'm in wealth management myself. High stakes, you know, but nothing like what you guys do. I was actually just telling my friends here about the military. My cousin Sarah is in the Army." Brett pointed directly at me. My stomach plummeted. I slowly turned my head, pulling my aviators off and hanging them on the collar of my shirt. There was no avoiding it. I met Mac's gaze. Mac looked over. He took in the gray hoodie, the dark jeans, the relaxed but guarded posture. He looked at my face. For a second, nothing happened. The polite, social smile remained plastered on his bearded face. Then his eyes locked onto mine. The smile vanished. I saw the exact moment the facial recognition software in his brain got a hit. His eyes widened a fraction of an inch. His posture shifted, unconsciously squaring off toward me, recognizing not a civilian niece, but a peer, a fellow predator in the room. He remembered the SIF in Bagram. He remembered the intel that kept his men alive. "Don't say it." I prayed silently, staring back at him with an intense, pleading look. "Please, Mac, don't say it." Mac was a professional. He read the room, read my posture, and saw Uncle Rick standing by the grill, watching the interaction with narrowed eyes. Mac gave me an imperceptible nod, a silent confirmation. He was going to play along. "Logistics, right?" Mac said smoothly, turning his attention back to Brett. "Vital work. Beans and bullets win wars." Brett laughed, a loud, patronizing sound. "Yeah, well, someone has to make sure the office supplies arrive on time. We were just talking about how some people take the desk jobs to avoid the real work, the muddy boots stuff." "Right. Mac?" I saw Mac's jaw tighten. The muscles in his forearms flexed slightly. He didn't like Brett. It took an operator exactly 3 seconds to identify a liability, and Brett was flashing neon signs. "Every job has its place, son," Mac said, his voice dropping a register, losing his friendly warmth. But Brett was blind to the warning signs. Empowered by the alcohol and desperate to prove his dominance in front of his friends and his father's war buddy, he was about to step on a landmine. "All right, everybody, grab a plate," Uncle Rick called out, breaking the rising tension. "Steaks are done, burgers are up, eat up before the fireworks start." The family converged on the massive outdoor dining table, a chaotic flurry of passing potato salad and pouring wine. I grabbed a small plate, put a single charred hot dog on it, and sat at the far end of the long teakwood table. I wanted to be as far away from the center of attention as possible. Unfortunately, fate had other plans. Brett ushered Mac to the seat directly across from me. While he took the chair to Mac's right, Chad and Tyler flanked them. My mother and Aunt Susan sat at the opposite end, happily oblivious to the psychological warfare occurring on the patio. Uncle Rick took his place at the head of the table, his eyes darting between me, Mac, and his son. The clinking of silverware filled the air. I took a bite of my food, chewing methodically, keeping my eyes on my plate. "So, Mac," Brett started, his voice projecting down the table. "Dad says you were a sniper. That's insane. I mean, the mental fortitude that must take to actually pull the trigger." "It's a job," Mac said curtly, cutting his steak. "Well, it's a job for real men," Brett continued, leaning back in his chair and swirling his beer. "Not like the modern military." I was telling Sarah earlier, no offense, Sarah, just talking facts, that lowering the physical standards for women is a threat to national security. I mean, imagine being pinned down in a firefight and relying on someone who can't even carry a heavy pack. Silence fell over our end of the table. Uncle Rick stopped chewing. He slowly placed his fork down on his plate. "Brett," Uncle Rick warned, a low growl in the back of his throat. "What? Dad? We're just having a debate." Brett deflected, holding his hands up innocently. He turned to Mac, seeking validation. "Come on, Mac. You were in the thick of it. Tell her. Tell Sarah that sitting in an air-conditioned room in Germany ordering printer toner doesn't make her a warrior. Tell her that if things went kinetic, she'd be a liability." The air on the deck seemed to freeze. Even the crickets in the surrounding woods seemed to stop chirping. Mac slowly placed his knife and fork on his plate. He didn't look at Brett. He looked directly across the table at me. His eyes traced the subtle way I was sitting, the way I braced my left arm against the table to relieve the pressure on my cracked ribs. He saw right through the gray hoodie. He saw the bandages underneath. Mac picked up his napkin, wiped his mouth, and tossed it onto the table. "Printer toner," Mac repeated softly. "Yeah," Brett sneered. "Logistics." Mac turned his head slowly, locking his piercing blue eyes onto Brett. The absolute lethal stillness of the man was terrifying up close. "Son," Mac said, his voice quiet, calm, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Do you know what a high-value target package is?" Brett blinked, confused by the sudden shift in tone. Like a terrorist leader?" "Exactly," Mac said. 3 years ago, my team was tasked with hunting down a senior facilitator for a localized terror cell in the Helmand province. Nasty guy. He liked to wire IEDs into elementary schools. We had no actionable intelligence. We were flying blind in a valley crawling with hostile fighters. My mother, sensing the heavy atmosphere, stopped talking to Aunt Susan and looked over. The whole table was now silently watching Mac. The CIA couldn't find him. NSA signals intercepts were useless, Mac continued, leaning his heavy forearms on the table. But we got a tip, from a ghost, an operative who had infiltrated the local populace, someone who had spent 3 weeks living in the dirt, eating garbage, wearing local garments, and tracking this man's movements from the shadows. Brett frowned. "Okay. What does that have to do with—" "Shut up and listen," Uncle Rick snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. Brett jumped in his seat. "This operative," Mac said, never taking his eyes off Brett, "identified the compound. But to confirm the target, this operative had to laze the building for our air support. They had to get within 200 meters of a heavily fortified enemy position." Mac paused, his eyes flicking to me for a fraction of a second before returning to Brett. "The operative was compromised, took shrapnel to the leg and ribs from an RPG blast. But instead of calling for immediate medevac and blowing the mission, this operative low-crawled a quarter mile through raw sewage, bleeding out, to get eyes on the target. They held the laser on the compound while taking sustained, heavy machine gun fire, long enough for an AC-130 gunship to level the building. Aunt Susan gasped softly. My mother looked horrified. Because of that operative, Mac said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. My team survived. We went in, did the BDA, and made it home to our families. That operative was a member of a highly classified unit that officially does not exist. Mac finally broke his gaze away from Brett. He looked across the table, directly into my eyes. They call them Task Force Orange, Mac said loudly, ensuring every single person at the table heard him. But in the SIF, we just called her Captain Hayes, or by her call sign, Omen 6. The silence that followed was absolute, deafening, and complete. You could have heard a pine needle drop on the wooden deck. My mother's mouth was slightly open, her eyes darting frantically between me and Mac, trying to process the impossibility of his words. Her daughter, the quiet girl who managed supply spreadsheets, crawling through sewage under machine gun fire. Tyler and Chad looked like they were going to be sick. They slowly slid their chairs back, unconsciously wanting to distance themselves from Brett. And Brett was destroyed. The smug, arrogant finance bro was gone. His face was gray, his jaw slack. He looked at Mac, then at his father, who was staring at him with absolute, unyielding disgust. Finally, Brett looked at me. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The phone call in the study, the coordinates, the gunfire he thought was a video game. It wasn't a prank. It was my life. I wasn't the weak link of the family. I was the apex predator, hiding in plain sight, letting him bark because a wolf doesn't concern itself with the opinions of a chihuahua. You? You're Omen 6? Brett whispered, his voice trembling so badly it cracked. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I just looked at him with the cold, dead eyes of a ghost who had seen too much. I told you, Brett, I said softly, the silence of the deck amplifying my voice. Stick to talking about hedge funds. You don't know the first thing about surviving in the dark. Uncle Rick stood up at the head of the table. He didn't yell. The quiet disappointment was far more devastating. Brett, Rick said, go to your car. Pack your friends. Leave my house. Now, Brett didn't argue. He didn't try to defend himself. He was utterly, comprehensively defeated. He stood up on shaky legs, his eyes locked on the wooden floorboards, and practically ran toward the house. Tyler and Chad trailing behind him like frightened shadows. The table remained frozen. Nobody knew what to say. Mac reached across the table, picking up his beer. He raised it in the air, looking directly at me. A smile, genuine and full of immense respect, broke through his thick beard. It's an honor to finally share a meal with you, Captain. Mac said. I looked at him, then at Uncle Rick, who was raising his glass of water in a silent salute. My mother was crying softly, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, overwhelming realization of what her daughter truly was. I reached forward with my right hand, ignoring the dull throb in my ribs, and picked up my plastic cup of sparkling water. The honor is mine, Master Chief, I replied. I took a sip. For the first time in years, the water didn't taste like ash and dust. It tasted like home. The sound of Brett's leased Porsche roaring to life in the driveway and gravel spinning under its tires was the only thing that broke the spell on the deck. He was fleeing, retreating to whatever safe space his bruised ego could find, leaving the rest of us in the wreckage of my shattered cover story. I kept my eyes on my plastic cup of sparkling water. The condensation was pooling onto the teakwood table, a tiny, localized flood. Sarah? The voice was brittle, trembling like a dry autumn leaf. I slowly turned my head. My mother, Diane, was staring at me. The polite, superficial barbecue facade had completely melted off her face, replaced by a profound, agonizing mixture of horror and awe. She was gripping her wine glass so tightly her knuckles were stark white. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice as gentle and steady as possible. "Is it true?" she whispered, tears finally breaching her lower lashes and tracing tracks through her makeup. What, he said. "The sewage. The gunfire. Is it true?" I hated this. This was exactly why the veil existed. The secrecy wasn't just to protect the mission, it was to protect the families. Mothers shouldn't have to visualize their daughters bleeding out in foreign dirt while trying to guide hellfire down on terrorists. They were supposed to think we were safe behind heavily guarded perimeter fences, eating at the mess hall, and filing paperwork. I looked at Uncle Rick. He gave me a slow, solemn nod. "You're out of the shadows now. Own it." "Yes, Mom, it's true," I said softly. Aunt Susan, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly gasped, putting a hand over her mouth. "But the logistics? The supply chain job in Stuttgart? You sent us postcards from Germany." "The military maintains forward operating bases in Germany. Aunt Susan," I explained, my operational cadence slipping back into my voice. "It's a major transit hub. It makes for a perfect, verifiable cover. I have a desk there. I have a civilian apartment there, but I only use them between deployments. Most of my time is spent elsewhere." "Where?" my mother asked, her voice cracking. "Where have you been, Sarah, for the last 4 years?" "Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa," I replied evenly. "Places that don't make the evening news. Places where we aren't officially operating." "My God," my mother choked out, burying her face in his hands. "Every time the phone rang late at night, every time you didn't answer my texts for weeks, I just thought you were busy doing inventory. I didn't know you were. You could have." She couldn't finish the sentence. The reality of my mortality was crashing down on her all at once. I pushed my chair back and walked over to her, wrapping my arms around her trembling shoulders. I winced as the movement pulled at my ribs, but I suppressed the groan. "I'm here. Mom," I whispered into her hair. "I'm safe. I'm right here." "Why didn't you tell me?" she sobbed, looking up at me with red, pleading eyes. "I'm your mother. You lied to me." Mac leaned forward, his heavy, tattooed forearms resting on the table. "She lied to keep you safe, Diane," he said, his gravelly voice carrying an unexpected gentleness. "The people Sarah hunts. They have long memories and long arms. If they knew her identity, they could track her family. It's the hardest rule of the Shadow War. You lie to the people you love the most so they can sleep peacefully at night. And it's a burden she carried alone," Uncle Rick added, walking over and placing a hand on my mother's shoulder. "Diane, what your daughter does, the level of courage it takes. There are men with chests full of medals who couldn't survive a week in her world. She is a Tier 1 intelligence operative. She is the tip of the spear." My mother reached up and touched my cheek. She looked at me, not as the little girl who used to scrape her knees riding bicycles, but as a stranger, a ghost. "I don't understand it," she whispered, "but I am so terrified and so proud of you, Sarah." Aunt Susan, however, was struggling with a different reality. The expulsion of her son was finally registering. "Rick," Susan said, her voice rising in defensive panic. "You didn't have to throw Brett out like that. He didn't know. He was just making a joke. He's your son." Uncle Rick turned his icy gaze to his sister-in-law. "Susan, Brett is 32 years old. He is a grown man, and he spent the entire afternoon trying to humiliate a woman he believed was beneath him. He exposed a rot in his character today that I will not tolerate in my house. Ignorance is a condition. Arrogance is a choice. He made his choice." "But he's family," she protested. "So is she," Rick fired back, pointing at me. and she bled for this country while he was trading crypto in a penthouse. Do not defend him to me right now. Susan. The subject is closed. The finality in his voice silenced the table. The air was thick, charged with the emotional debris of the explosion. The fireworks are starting soon, Max said, seamlessly stepping in to diffuse the localized tension. He stood up, stretching his massive frame. Sarah, grab a fresh ice pack from the kitchen. We're going to the boathouse. It wasn't a request. It was an exfiltration. I gave my mother one last squeeze. I'll be right back. Mom, just process it. It's still me. I promise. As I turned to follow Mac and Uncle Rick down the sloping lawn toward the lake, I felt the phantom weight of my secret lifting off my shoulders. It was a terrifying, liberating sensation. The camouflage was gone. I was finally breathing real air. The boathouse was a detached, rustic cedar structure perched over the dark, rippling waters of Lake Tahoe. It smelled of motor oil, damp canvas, and old wood. The first massive mortar shell of the town's fireworks display detonated overhead, painting the water outside the window in a brilliant, violent burst of red and gold. I sat heavily on an overturned wooden crate, finally letting my guard down. I unzipped my gray hoodie, letting it fall open, revealing the tight, white medical tape strapped tightly across my left rib cage beneath my t-shirt. Mac walked over, tossing a cold, blue gel pack at me. I caught it with my right hand and pressed it against my side, letting out a long, ragged exhale. Who taped you up, Captain? Mac asked, leaning against the hull of a vintage Chris Craft speedboat. Looks like a blind corpsman did it in the back of a moving Humvee. Close. I grunted. It was a medic in the back of a blacked-out Hilux bouncing over a dry riverbed in Djibouti. I didn't exactly have time for a clean hospital corner. Uncle Rick walked in behind us, carrying 3 bottles of dark stout beer. He handed one to Mac, one to me, and kept one for himself. From Djibouti, Rick mused, taking a slow sip. Things getting hot over there again? Always, I said. Al-Shabaab is pushing north. We were tracking a munitions facilitator. Exfil went kinetic. An RPG hit the wall behind me. Kevlar caught the frag. Kinetic force caught the ribs. You shouldn't even be walking right now, Mac observed, his eyes scanning my posture with professional scrutiny. I had to maintain the cover, I said, staring at the label on my beer. If I showed up limping and groaning, the questions would start. Did you fall off a forklift, Sarah? Did a pallet of paper crush you? It was easier to just pop ibuprofen and shut up. Rick pulled up a stool and sat down facing me. The booming of the fireworks outside was rhythmic, a percussive soundtrack to the quiet isolation of the boathouse. I knew something was off, Rick said softly. You've been carrying yourself differently for years, but when that satellite phone rang, that sound, you never forget the sound of a live talk feed. I'm sorry it went down like that, Uncle Rick, I said, looking him in the eyes. I never intended to disrespect your home or humiliate Brett in front of the family. Stop, Rick commanded, holding up a hand. Do not carry his water. Sarah, Brett is a product of privilege he didn't earn. I take the blame for that. I shielded him from the harshness of the world because I saw too much of it. I thought I was protecting him. Instead, I made him soft. I made him arrogant. Today was a wake-up call he desperately needed. Mac nodded in agreement. In the teams, we call it the reality check. Some guys get it in Buddhist training when the surf hits them. Some guys get it on their first deployment when the bullets snap past their ears. Brett got his at a barbecue. Better late than never. I took a drink of the stout. It was rich, bitter, and heavy. How did you know it was me? Mac. In Bagram, I was completely sterile. No name tags. I wore a balaclava most of the time. Mac smiled, the scars around his eyes crinkling. The eyes, Captain. You have cold eyes when you brief. You look at a target package not like a human being, but like a math equation that needs to be erased. And your voice. You have a very specific cadence when you rattle off grid coordinates. When you stood up to Brett on the deck and dropped your voice, it clicked. The ghost from Bagram was drinking sparkling water at Rick's house. You saved my team in Helmand. Matt continued, his tone turning fiercely sincere. That laser designation. We were boxed in. The DSHK fire was chewing our cover to splinters. If that AC-130 hadn't dropped its payload exactly when it did, I wouldn't be standing here. I owe you my life. Omen 6. We do the job, Master Chief. I replied automatically. We get the boys home. No, Mac insisted, stepping forward and clapping a heavy hand on my uninjured shoulder. Don't brush it off with the company line. You didn't just do the job. You went above and beyond the call of duty. You took the hit and held the line. That's valor. Uncle Rick raised his beer bottle. To the ghosts in the machine. To the ghosts, Mac echoed. I raised my bottle, clinking it against theirs. For the first time since joining the activity, I didn't feel entirely alone. The Shadow War was a solitary confinement cell built of secrets, but in this boathouse, illuminated by the flashes of fireworks, I had found 2 men who spoke my language, 2 men who knew the weight of the silence. So, what happens now? Rick asked, looking out the window at the lake. Now, I sighed, standing up slowly. Now, I pack my bags. The family knows. The dynamic is permanently altered. I can't sit around and eat potato salad while my mother looks at me like I'm a live hand grenade. She just needs time. Sarah, Rick said gently. I don't have time. Uncle Rick, I replied. My decompression leave ends in 48 hours. I have to report back to Fort Liberty, and then I'm likely getting spun up for a redeployment to clean up the mess in Djibouti. I need to get back to my safe house and prep my gear. Rick nodded, understanding the grim reality of the operational tempo. There was no true rest for the wicked, and certainly none for those who hunted them. I'll walk you to your car, Mac offered. I appreciate it, but I've got it, I said, offering them both a genuine, albeit tired, smile. Stay here. Enjoy the fireworks. Have another beer. I'll slip out the side gate. Keep your head down, Captain, Mac said. Always. I zipped my hoodie back up, the armor of the civilian world settling back into place, and walked out of the boathouse. The night air was crisp, laced with the smell of sulfur from the fireworks. I navigated the perimeter of the property, avoiding the patio where the rest of the family was gathered, and made my way toward the long, gravel driveway. I was ready to vanish back into the dark, but the dark wasn't done with me yet. My vehicle was a nondescript, matte black Toyota 4Runner parked near the massive stone pillars at the entrance of the estate. It looked like a standard civilian SUV, but the chassis was reinforced. The windows were ballistic glass, and a hidden compartment in the trunk held enough specialized hardware to overthrow a small municipality. I unlocked the doors with the fob in my pocket, the headlights flashing once in the darkness. As I reached for the driver's side handle, a shadow detached itself from the thick line of cedar trees bordering the driveway. Leaving so soon, Captain? I didn't flinch. My situational awareness had tracked the disruption in the gravel and the heavy scent of alcohol 30 yards back, but I hadn't perceived an imminent lethal threat, so I let it play out. I turned around slowly. Brett emerged into the glow of the 4Runner's taillights. He was a mess. His polo shirt was untucked, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes were red and wild. He swayed slightly on his feet. But it wasn't just drunken sorrow, it was a desperate, vicious rage. He hadn't left. He had parked his Porsche down the street and hiked back through the woods, waiting for an opportunity to salvage whatever shreds of his ego remained. And in his right hand, he held his iPhone. The camera lens pointed directly at me, the red recording light blinking. Brett, I said, my voice slipping back into the flat, absolute coldness of Omen 6. Put the phone down and go home. No, he slurred, taking a belligerent step forward. No, You don't get to just ruin my life and walk away. My dad looked at me like I was garbage. My friends are laughing at me. You humiliated me in front of a goddamn Navy SEAL. You humiliated yourself. Brett, I just stopped hiding it. Oh, you think you're so untouchable, he spat, holding the phone higher. The great secret agent, task force, whatever. What happens if I tweet this right now? What happens if I go live on Instagram and tell the whole world that Sarah Hayes is a covert assassin? Let's see how much the government likes you when your face is plastered all over the internet. A cold, mechanical calm washed over me. This was no longer a family squabble. This was a direct breach of operational security. This was a threat to my life, the lives of my team, and the integrity of a classified unit. Brett, listen to me very carefully, I said, not moving a muscle. If you press send on that phone, you are committing a felony under the Espionage Act. You are actively endangering national security. The people I work for will not issue a subpoena. They will simply disappear you. Bullshit, he yelled. You're just trying to scare me. You're just a... He didn't finish the sentence. I closed the distance between us in a fraction of a second. The pain in my ribs was entirely suppressed by the adrenaline of a combat reflex. Before his brain could register that I had moved, my left hand clamped over his right wrist, twisting it sharply outward. Brett yelped in pain as his fingers involuntarily opened, dropping the phone. Before the device hit the gravel, my right hand snaked up and gripped him by the throat. I didn't crush his windpipe, but I applied enough precise pressure to the carotid artery to instantly panic his central nervous system. I swept my leg behind his knees and drove him backward, slamming him hard onto the hood of my 4Runner. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet driveway. Brett gasped, his eyes bulging in absolute terror. He was paralyzed, pinned to the reinforced steel by a woman he outweighed by 40 pounds, unable to breathe, unable to move. I told you once today, I whispered, leaning in so my face was inches from his. My voice was a dead, hollow thing. You do not know how to survive in the dark. You think this is a game. You think consequences only happen in boardrooms. I reached down with my left hand and scooped his phone off the gravel. Let me show you how the real world works. Brett? Still pinning him to the hood by his throat, I held his phone up to his face. The facial recognition unlocked the screen instantly. I navigated to his camera roll, deleted the video he had just taken, and then went to his settings. What are you doing? He choked out. Erasing a liability, I said. I quickly navigated to the core system settings and initiated a complete factory wipe of the device. The screen went black. Then the Apple logo appeared with a loading bar. All his data, his contacts, his photos, his secure banking apps, gone. I tossed the resetting brick of glass and metal onto his chest. Then, I reached into my jacket and pulled out my heavy, black satellite phone. I hit a single speed dial button. Overlord, Omen 6, I said into the receiver, my eyes never leaving Brett's terrified face. Go ahead, Overlord. I need a localized electronic containment protocol executed. Target is a civilian. Brett Hayes. I need his social media accounts locked, his cloud storage scrubbed for the last hour of uploads, and a flag placed on his telecommunications for the word Omen or ISA. Copy that. Overlord. Executing containment protocol now. Do you require physical cleanup? Brett whimpered, fresh tears springing to his eyes as he heard the synthesized voice of the military operator on the other end, asking if he needed to be cleaned up. Negative, Overlord, I said, releasing my grip on Brett's throat and taking a step back. Target has been neutralized and educated. Going dark? I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Brett remained sprawled on the hood of my SUV, gasping for air, clutching his wiped phone to his chest like a child holding a broken toy. Suddenly, the crunch of heavy boots on gravel approached rapidly from the direction of the house. Uncle Rick emerged from the shadows, a heavy maglite flashlight in his hand, its beam cutting through the darkness. He took in the scene instantly, me standing calmly by my door, Brett hyperventilating on the hood of the car. I saw him sneaking back up the driveway from the balcony. Rick said, his voice hard. He walked over and grabbed Brett by the collar of his polo shirt, hauling him off the hood and throwing him onto the ground. Brett scrambled backward like a crab, away from his father. He tried to record me, Uncle Rick, I said simply. Threatened to post my identity online. Rick's jaw clenched so hard I thought I heard a tooth crack. The fury emanating from him was absolute. You goddamn fool, Rick hissed at his son. You absolute, reckless fool. Do you know what they would have done to you? To us? Rick pulled a pair of heavy zip ties from his back pocket, a relic from his past that he apparently still carried out of habit. He grabbed Brett's hands, flipped him over, and ruthlessly bound his wrists behind his back. Dad, what are you doing? Brett screamed, panic finally breaking his mind. I'm calling the police, Rick said coldly, hauling Brett to his feet by the zip ties. I'm telling them a drunk trespasser is on my property. You can spend the weekend in the county jail. Maybe the cold concrete will sober you up and teach you the lesson you refused to learn today. Rick turned to me. The anger vanished, replaced by a profound, tired respect. Go, Sarah, Rick said. Get out of here. I'll handle the cleanup on this end. He won't remember anything but the hangover by tomorrow. I looked at the pathetic, sobbing figure of my cousin. There was no victory here. No satisfaction, just the grim, necessary maintenance of the shadows. Thank you, Uncle Rick, I said. Drive safe, Captain. He replied, dragging his son back toward the house. I opened the door of the 4Runner, climbed into the driver's seat, and hit the ignition. The powerful engine roared to life. I put it in gear, turned the wheel, and drove away from Lake Tahoe, away from the fireworks, and away from the family that finally knew my name. As I merged onto the dark, empty highway heading south toward the Nevada desert, the throbbing in my ribs returned. I reached over, adjusted the radio to a quiet static, and let the isolation swallow me whole. The barbecue was over. The ghost was going back to war. The drive from the lush, pine-scented mountains of Lake Tahoe down into the arid, unforgiving expanse of the Nevada desert is a transition that always mirrored my own life. I left behind the cool, comfortable illusion of civilization and descended into the stark, barren reality of the world I actually inhabited. My safe house was a nondescript, single-story cinder block structure on the outskirts of Reno, registered to a Shell LLC that officially imported agricultural irrigation equipment. I pulled the 4Runner into the attached garage, the heavy steel door rumbling shut behind me, sealing me inside the sterile environment. The digital clock on the dashboard read Oreo 3 time 14 a.m. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I spent the next 4 hours stripping my gear, cleaning my sidearm with methodical precision, and replacing the medical tape on my ribs. The bruising had spread, a vast, ugly canvas of purple and yellow blooming across my left flank. Every breath was a sharp reminder of the razor-thin margin between life and death. At 700 hours, my encrypted laptop chirped. I set down my coffee mug, walked over to the steel desk, and initiated the secure handshake protocol. The screen flickered, revealing the grim, tired face of Colonel Thomas Miller, my commanding officer at the intelligence support activity. Miller was a man carved from granite and duty, a veteran of Panama, Mogadishu, and every sandbox in between. Omen 6, Miller greeted, his voice raspy from too much bad coffee and not enough sleep. Morning, boss, I replied, sitting up straight despite the pain. I thought I had another 36 hours of mandatory decompression. You did, Miller said, his eyes scanning something on his secondary monitor. Until your little localized containment protocol pinged the NSA's domestic surveillance grid at 2200 hours last night. You want to tell me why you requested a total electronic blackout on a civilian in the middle of a family barbecue? I sighed, rubbing the bridge of my nose. Compromise, Colonel. A family member attempted to record me and threatened to expose my identity on social media following a heated altercation regarding my cover story. Miller didn't blink. The threat was neutralized? Device was wiped and bricked. Overlord scrubbed the localized cloud. The individual was subdued and handed over to local law enforcement for trespassing by another family member. The physical threat is zero. The physical threat from the idiot is zero, Miller corrected, leaning forward, his face filling the screen. But in the digital age, there is no such thing as a silent gunshot. Captain, you know this. My blood ran a degree colder. What did we leak, boss? When your cousin powered up his camera, his phone automatically pinged the nearest cell tower to prepare for an iCloud sync, Miller explained, his tone strictly business. Overlord caught it and killed the upload. But the anomaly, a sudden, highly classified military cyber protocol activating in a civilian sector in Tahoe, created a ripple. Miller tapped a key, and a stream of data appeared on my screen. 20 minutes after your containment protocol, a known foreign intelligence scraper, operating through a proxy server out of Venezuela but tied back to Syrian intelligence, flagged the anomaly. They recognized the digital footprint of the JSOC cyber warfare suite. They started digging into the geolocation. Syrian intelligence, I repeated, the dots connecting in my head with terrifying speed. The munitions facilitator we hit in Djibouti last week. He was backed by Damascus. Exactly, Miller said heavily. They are looking for the team that fed the coordinates. They are looking for you. Omen 6. And while they don't have your name, they now have a geographic radius. They know a JSOC asset was operating in the Lake Tahoe Basin last night. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. My family is there. I know, Miller said. And while it's a needle in a haystack, foreign agents operating domestically don't need a name if they can identify the target's associates. We picked up chatter on the dark web 30 minutes ago. A bounty has been authorized for any information regarding the Tahoe anomaly. Panic, a cold, unfamiliar serpent, coiled in my stomach. I was trained to endure torture, to bleed out in silence, to face down hostile fire. But my mother? Aunt Susan. They didn't know how to check for trackers. They didn't know how to clear a blind spot. I need to extract them, I said, my voice dropping to that lethal, flat tone. I cannot authorize a military domestic extraction for civilians without presidential approval. Sarah, the optics alone. I am not asking for a JSOC bird. Colonel, I interrupted, a dangerous edge in my voice. I am requesting 48 hours of dark leave, no tether, no backup. I will secure my assets privately. Miller stared at me through the screen. He knew the risk. He also knew that if he said no, I was going to do it anyway, and he would lose one of his best operatives to a court-martial. You have 48 hours, Captain. Miller finally said, keep it quiet. Keep it off the grid. If you get into a shootout in California, I will deny you exist. Understood. And Sarah? Miller added softly. Godspeed. The screen went black. I slammed the laptop shut and grabbed my go bag. The barbecue was over, but the war had just followed me home. The drive back to Tahoe took exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes. I pushed the heavily modified engine of the 4Runner to its absolute limits, weaving through early morning Sunday traffic like a ghost. I didn't call my mother. I didn't call Aunt Susan. I called the one man I knew would immediately grasp the tactical reality of the situation. Talk to me. Uncle Rick answered on the first ring. It was 7:45 hours. We have a situation, I said, bypassing all pleasantries. The containment protocol last night created a digital footprint. Foreign intelligence scraped it. They know an operative is tied to the lake. I have a credible, imminent threat assessment on the family. There was a half-second of dead air as 24 years of Navy SEAL training instantly overrode the relaxed demeanor of a retired suburban dad. Timeline? Rick asked. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. "I'm 10 minutes out," I replied. "I need everyone packed for a minimum 72-hour relocation. No cell phones, no smartwatches, no laptops. Strip the batteries out of everything. We are going completely dark." "Mac is still here," Rick noted. "He slept in the guest room." "Good. Tell him to gear up. We are going to need the extra guns." "Understood. We'll be ready." The line went dead. When I tore up the long gravel driveway and skidded to a halt in front of the house, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Mac was standing on the front porch, a heavy, unmarked canvas duffel bag at his feet. He was wearing tactical khakis, a dark windbreaker, and an expression that promised absolute violence to anyone who crossed him. I could see the distinct bulge of a concealed sidearm on his right hip. My mother and Aunt Susan were huddled by the front door. My mother looked terrified, clutching a small overnight bag, her eyes red and swollen from a night of crying. Aunt Susan, however, was in a state of hostile denial. "This is ridiculous!" Susan was yelling at Uncle Rick, who was systematically pulling the SIM cards out of 3 different iPhones and dropping them into a glass of water. "I have a Pilates class at 10. I have a life. We can't just run away into the woods because Sarah is paranoid." "Susan, shut your mouth and get in the car," Rick ordered, pointing toward his heavy-duty Ford F-250 parked next to my 4Runner. "I will not," Susan shrieked. "Where is Brett? Did you really leave my nephew in jail overnight? He needs a lawyer, not an armed guard." As if summoned by her frantic denial, a beat-up yellow taxi crested the top of the driveway, crunching slowly over the gravel. It rolled to a stop, and the back door opened. Brett stumbled out. He looked like a corpse that had been reanimated by sheer misery. His designer polo was stained, his face was pale and greasy, and he was shivering despite the warm morning sun. The county jail had clearly not been kind to the wealth manager from San Francisco. He looked up, expecting to slink into the house and nurse his hangover. Instead, he saw his father heavily armed, Mac scanning the tree line like a predator, and me stepping out of my armored SUV looking like the Grim Reaper. What's going on?" Brett stammered, freezing by the taxi. I walked straight toward him. He flinched, instinctively raising his hands to protect his throat. The memory of last night clearly burned into his central nervous system. "Pay the cab driver," I barked. My phone is dead. I don't have my wallet. Dad took it." Brett stuttered. Mac stepped forward, tossed a crumpled $50 bill through the cab's open window, and slapped the roof. The cab driver, sensing the lethal atmosphere, threw it in reverse and sped away without a word. "Listen to me, all of you," I said, my voice echoing across the driveway, cutting through Susan's protests and Brett's confusion. I locked eyes with my family. Last night, Brett's little stunt broadcast a signal. The people I fight, the people who wire bombs to cars and burn people alive, they picked up that signal. They are currently looking for this house. If they find you, they will not ask you for your stock portfolio. Brett. They will skin you alive to get to me." Aunt Susan gasped, all the color draining from her face. Her denial finally shattered against the concrete wall of reality. Brett's knees buckled slightly. He grabbed the side of his father's truck to steady himself. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Oh my God, I'm sorry. I didn't know." "We don't have time for apologies," Mac growled, stepping into the center of the group. "Rick, take Diane and Susan in the truck. Captain, you take the liability in your vehicle. I'll ride shotgun with you and run counter surveillance." "Where are we going?" my mother asked, her voice trembling. "My property in Wyoming," Mac stated. "It's off the grid, heavily fortified, and accessible only by a single dirt road. We dig in there until the captain's people sweep the digital footprint." "Move!" Rick shouted. The family scrambled. There was no more arguing. Fear is a universal language, and right now, it was speaking loud and clear. I grabbed Brett by the shoulder and shoved him toward the back seat of the 4Runner. He tumbled in, curling into a tight ball, trembling violently. Max slid into the passenger seat next to me, instantly pulling a short-barreled, suppressed PDW, personal defense weapon, from his duffel bag and resting it across his lap. He checked the chamber, his movements smooth and practiced. "Comms check," I said, pulling out a pair of encrypted two-way radios. I handed one to Mac, who tossed it to Rick in the truck. "Check." Rick's voice crackled back. "I have the lead," I said, shifting the Forerunner into drive. "Keep your spacing tight. If we take contact, do not stop. You drive through it." "Copy that," Rick replied. I hit the gas, the tires spitting gravel as we shot down the driveway, leaving the picturesque lake house and the last remnants of our normal family dynamic behind us. The first 2 hours of the drive northeast toward the Nevada border were a tense, suffocating silence. In the back seat, Brett was curled against the door, staring out the reinforced window with hollow, unblinking eyes. The hangover, combined with the sheer, crushing terror of the situation, had seemingly broken his spirit entirely. The arrogant frat boy who had mocked my boots 24 hours ago was dead. In his place was a frightened child realizing that the monsters under the bed were real, and they were armed with AK-47s. "You doing okay back there, Brett?" Mac asked, not turning around, his eyes constantly scanning the side mirrors. Brett swallowed hard. "Are they really coming to kill us?" "If they find us, yes." Mac answered bluntly. No sugarcoating. No corporate HR speak. That's why you keep your head down and you do exactly what you are told. You've played the big man your whole life. Son, now it's time to see if you can follow orders. I will. I swear. I won't cause any trouble. Brett's voice broke. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. My ribs were throbbing, sending shooting pains up my neck, and the exhaustion was beginning to blur the edges of my vision, but I felt a strange, cold pity for him. "I know you didn't, Brett," I said quietly. "But ignorance isn't armor. The world doesn't care what you don't know." We merged onto Interstate 80, the vast, desolate stretches of the high desert opening up before us. The sun was baking the asphalt, creating shimmering mirages on the horizon. I checked my mirrors. Uncle Rick's heavy Ford F-250 was holding a perfect 4-second following distance behind us. "Captain," Max said suddenly, his voice dropping an octave. "I see it," I replied, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. 3 cars back, in the left lane. A dark gray Dodge Durango with heavily tinted windows. It had been pacing us for the last 15 miles. It wasn't gaining, and it wasn't passing. It was just sitting in our blind spot, matching our speed fluctuations perfectly. "Rick," I said into the radio. "Status on your 6. "I got him." Rick's voice came back, calm and steady. "Gray Durango, Nevada plates. Been on us since the Reno interchange. Looks like a 2-man crew in the front. Can't see the back. Could be local law enforcement running a plate scanner," Max suggested, though his thumb instinctively moved to the safety selector on his weapon. "Let's test it," I said. I signaled right, smoothly accelerating and changing lanes to pass a slow-moving semi-truck. Rick followed perfectly, shielding our rear. The Durango didn't move. It stayed in the left lane, falling back slightly behind the semi. "Maybe we're paranoid," Brett whispered from the back seat, leaning forward slightly. "Sit back," Max snapped, as soon as we cleared the semi. I signaled left and moved back into the fast lane. 3 seconds later, the Durango ripped past the semi, cut aggressively across 2 lanes of traffic without a signal, and settled right back into its pacing position. 3 cars behind Uncle Rick. "That's a negative on a coincidence," Max said, his eyes narrowing. "We are burned. They tracked the vehicles from the house." "Damn it," I hissed. The Syrian proxy cell was faster than I anticipated. They must have had assets operating locally on the West Coast to mobilize a surveillance team this quickly. Omen 6, what's the play? Rick asked over the radio. I could hear Aunt Susan crying softly in the background of the transmission. I looked at the GPS mapped on my dashboard. We were approaching a steep, winding mountain pass that cut through a desolate canyon. No exits, no cell service, and steep drops on either side. It was a perfect choke point. If they wanted to hit us, they would do it there. Rick, they are going to try and box us in the canyon, I said, my voice slipping into the clinical rhythm of a tactical briefing. I need you to run interference. When I give the word, you hit the brakes and block the lanes. I will punch through. Do not let them pit maneuver the truck. Copy that, Rick said. I'll hold the line. Dad, what's he going to do? Brett panicked, grabbing my seat. Keep your hands off the driver, son, Mac roared, shoving Brett back against the seat. Your father has survived more ambushes than you've had hot dinners. He knows what he's doing. We hit the incline of the canyon. The road narrowed to 2 lanes, flanked by jagged rock walls on the right and a guardrail overlooking a steep, rocky ravine on the left. In my mirror, the Durango suddenly surged forward. They're making their move, Max said, bracing his feet against the floorboards. The Durango accelerated hard, closing the gap between itself and Rick's truck. They weren't trying to follow anymore. They were initiating contact. Rick, brace for impact, I yelled into the radio. The Durango swerved into the oncoming lane, ignoring the double yellow line, trying to pull up alongside the F-250 to force it off the road. But Uncle Rick was a Tier 1 operator. He didn't panic. He didn't swerve away. As the Durango pulled parallel, Rick violently jerked the steering wheel to the left. The massive, 3-ton steel chassis of the F-250 slammed into the passenger side of the Durango with a sickening crunch of metal. The Durango sparked against the guardrail, the driver fighting for control. Hit them again. Rick, I commanded. Rick obliged. He slammed the brakes, letting the Durango shoot forward a few feet, then pinned the gas, ramming the front quarter panel of his truck directly into the Durango's rear axle. The pit maneuver was flawless. The Durango spun wildly out of control, tires smoking and screeching. It slammed backward into the rock wall, shattering its taillights and crumpling the trunk, before bouncing back into the middle of the road, dead in the water. Rick expertly threaded the F-250 past the wreckage, not losing any momentum. Good hit, Rick, I breathed, checking the mirror. The Durango was smoking, blocking the lanes behind us. Captain, Max said quietly, pointing out the windshield. My stomach plummeted. Coming down the mountain, heading directly toward us in both lanes, were 2 black, unmarked Chevrolet Tahoes. They weren't swerving. They were accelerating. It's an anvil and hammer, Max said, his voice cold and analytical. The Durango was just pushing us forward. The hit team was waiting at the top. Hold on, I screamed. There was no room to maneuver. The canyon walls offered no escape. Mac, take the wheel, I yelled, letting go of the steering wheel and unbuckling my seatbelt. Mac didn't hesitate. He leaned over the center console, grabbing the steering wheel with his massive left hand, keeping the Forerunner steady at 70 miles per hour. I grabbed my Sig Sauer P320 from the tactical holster on my chest. I rolled down my driver's side window. The wind roared into the cabin, deafening and violent. Brett, get on the floor and cover your head, Mac roared. Brett was already sobbing on the floor mats, curled into a fetal position. The 2 Tahoes were less than 100 yards away and closing fast. I could see the silhouettes of men in the front seats. I leaned my upper body out the window, fighting the intense drag of the wind, my cracked ribs screaming in agony as they pressed against the heavy steel of the doorframe. I locked my arms, acquiring a 2-handed grip on the pistol, putting the front sight post squarely on the windshield of the lead Tahoe. Breathe in, exhale, squeeze. I fired 3 rapid, suppressed shots. Pfft, pfft, pfft. Even over the wind, I heard the distinctive spiderweb crack of ballistic glass. The rounds didn't penetrate. They were driving armored vehicles, but the sudden impact blinded the driver. The lead Tahoe swerved violently to the right, overcorrecting. It clipped the canyon wall, throwing sparks into the air, and careened back into the center of the road. The second Tahoe, trailing too closely, slammed the brakes to avoid rear-ending its partner. "Punch it! Mac!" I yelled, pulling myself back into the cabin. Mac slammed his foot onto the accelerator pedal over the center console. The 4Runner roared, surging forward. We shot the gap between the two staggered, smoking Tahoes, missing their bumpers by mere inches. I looked back. Uncle Rick's heavy truck barreled right through the opening behind us, clipping the mirror off one of the Tahoes but maintaining his speed. We crested the mountain pass and began the steep descent down the other side, leaving the ambush behind us. I collapsed back into my seat, gasping for air, the adrenaline beginning to crash. My ribs felt like they were on fire. Mac smoothly handed control of the steering wheel back to me. He checked his side mirror, then looked over at me. "Nice shooting, Captain," he said calmly, as if we had just finished a round of golf. I looked in the rearview mirror. Brett was slowly pulling himself up from the floorboards. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He looked at the pistol in my hand, then out the window at the desolate canyon we had just survived. He finally understood. This wasn't a spreadsheet. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation. This was my reality. And for the next 48 hours, it was his, too. The Nevada desert blurred past the reinforced windows of the 4Runner, a featureless ocean of sagebrush and cracked earth. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the heavy hum of the engine and Brett's ragged, uneven breathing from the back seat. We had put 50 miles between us and the canyon ambush. I checked the rearview mirror obsessively. Uncle Rick's F-250 was still tucked firmly in my wake, its front grille smashed and one headlight dangling by a wire, but the engine was holding. "We need to ditch the vehicles," Max stated, breaking the silence. He was tapping away on a heavily encrypted GPS tablet, his thick fingers moving with surprising dexterity. They ran a pit maneuver and a block. That means they had eyes on us long enough to run the plates and cross-reference the chassis profiles. They'll have highway patrol proxies and local spotters looking for a black 4Runner and a smashed Ford. Agreed. I grunted, shifting my weight to relieve the searing pressure on my cracked ribs. The adrenaline from the shootout was leaching out of my bloodstream, leaving behind a cold, shivering exhaustion. "Where's our transition point?" "I have a friend with a salvage yard outside of Elko," Mac replied, tapping a coordinate on his screen. "Old Marine Corps buddy. Off the books. We leave the trucks in a shipping container, swap to clean, analog vehicles, no onboard computers, no GPS tracking, no satellite radio, just steel and carburetors." "Give me the heading," I said. 30 minutes later, we rolled into a sprawling, rust-choked graveyard of twisted metal and stacked shipping containers. The Nevada sun beat down mercilessly, creating a shimmering heat haze over the rusted car chassis. A heavy steel gate rolled open as we approached, operated by a man with a prosthetic leg and a shotgun slung casually over his shoulder. He gave Mac a brief, silent nod as we drove past. We pulled into a cavernous, corrugated metal warehouse at the back of the property. I killed the engine, and the sudden silence felt heavier than the gunfire. "Everyone out, grab your bags, move!" Uncle Rick barked, stepping out of his battered F-250. I opened my door, swinging my legs out, and stood up. The world tilted slightly on its axis. A sharp, white-hot lance of pain shot through my left side, and my vision swam with dark spots. I stumbled, grabbing the door frame to stay upright. "Sarah!" My mother's voice pierced the ringing in my ears. She ran over from the truck, her face pale, and threw her arms around me to stabilize my weight. I leaned into her, gritting my teeth. "I'm okay. Mom." I managed to lie, my voice strained. "Just move too fast." Max stepped around the front of the SUV, his eyes locking onto my left side. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered a tactical assessment. "You're bleeding, Captain," Mac observed flatly. I looked down. A dark, wet stain was blossoming through the heavy gray cotton of my hoodie, right over the bandages on my ribs. The violent maneuvering and leaning out the window to return fire had torn the wound open. Aunt Susan gasped, covering her mouth in horror. Brett, who had finally crawled out of the back seat, stared at the blood with wide, uncomprehending eyes. He looked sick. "It's surface laceration from the fragmentation," I said, waving it off and standing up straighter through sheer willpower. "It looks worse than it is. We don't have time to play doctor." "Diane, there's a trauma kit in the green duffel," Mac ordered, tossing a heavy bag onto the hood of the car. "Patch her up. We have 5 minutes before we roll out." My mother didn't hesitate. The superficial suburbanite who worried about centerpieces and neighborhood gossip was gone. In her place was a terrified but fiercely determined mother trying to keep her daughter alive. She unzipped the bag, pulling out sterile gauze, combat tape, and antiseptic wipes. "Take the sweatshirt off, Sarah," she commanded, her hands trembling only slightly. I unzipped the hoodie, exposing the blood-soaked bandages underneath, as my mother worked to cut away the old tape. Aunt Susan stood by the F-250, her arms crossed, shaking her head in frantic denial. "This is insane," Susan muttered loudly. "We are in a junkyard. We were just shot at. We need to call the police. Rick, the FBI, someone." "Susan, stop," Uncle Rick warned, pulling 2 heavy canvas bags from his truck bed. "No, I will not stop," she shrieked, the panic finally breaking her fragile composure. "This isn't our world. This is a movie. Brett, tell your father we need to go to a police station." She turned to Brett for support, but Brett just stared at the ground. His shoulders slumped. "Aunt Susan," I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria like a scalpel. I locked eyes with her as my mother pressed a new layer of gauze against my bleeding side. "The people chasing us have money and access. If you walk into a local precinct, they will intercept the dispatch call. They will send a cleanup team dressed as tactical officers. They will put a bullet in the back of your head in a holding cell and label it a tragic accident. Do you understand me?" Susan's mouth snapped shut. "We are the only security you have right now." I continued, wincing as my mother pulled the tape tight. "So please, for the love of God, keep quiet and get in the new vehicle." Mac returned, tossing a set of keys to Uncle Rick. "2 vehicles," Mac said. "A 1998 Jeep Cherokee and a 2003 Chevy Silverado. No computers. They run loud, but they run fast. Rick, take Diane and Susan in the Chevy. Captain, you're with me and the kid in the Jeep." We transferred our gear, the heavy silence of the junkyard pressing down on us. I climbed into the passenger seat of the dark green Jeep, my side throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache. Mac took the wheel. Brett sat in the back, staring blankly at the rusted floorboards. As we pulled out of the salvage yard and turned onto a desolate 2-lane highway heading north toward the Wyoming border, I pulled my encrypted satellite phone from my vest. "What are you doing?" Mac asked, his eyes on the road. "Checking the digital perimeter," I said, turning the device on. I bypassed the standard operating channels and accessed a passive monitoring frequency. I typed in the alphanumeric designation of the Syrian proxy cell I had hit in Djibouti. The screen immediately populated with heavily encrypted chatter. It was a digital hornet's nest. I couldn't read the exact messages. They were changing ciphers every 60 seconds, but I could read the metadata. "They aren't scrambling blindly," I said, a cold knot forming in my stomach. "The traffic volume is too focused. They are moving with a directional heading." "They have a vector?" Mac frowned. "How?" "We dumped the cars. We are completely analog." "I don't know," I murmured, my eyes scanning the data strings. "But they are still hunting. And they are headed north." We crossed the border into Wyoming just as the sun began to dip behind the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Wind River Range. The temperature plummeted, a stark contrast to the boiling Nevada desert. Mac's property was located at the end of a winding, unpaved logging road that hadn't seen a state maintenance truck in 2 decades. We drove for miles through dense, towering pine forests, the canopy so thick it choked out the remaining daylight. When we finally reached the compound, I understood why Mac chose it. It wasn't a cabin. It was a fortified redoubt. Built from massive, interlocking timber logs, the structure sat on a raised concrete foundation overlooking a steep ravine. There was only one road in and one road out. The windows were small, narrow, and made of reinforced ballistic glass. Heavy steel shutters were pinned back against the exterior walls, ready to be dropped into place. A massive array of solar panels on the roof fed an underground battery bank, ensuring total off-grid capability. "Welcome to the middle of nowhere," Mac grunted, cutting the engine of the Jeep. We piled out. The air was thin and bitingly cold. I drew in a deep breath, instantly regretting it as my cracked ribs protested. "Inside. Now," Uncle Rick ordered, ushering my mother and Susan toward the heavy steel door. Mac unlocked it, revealing a surprisingly warm and well-furnished interior, leather couches, a stone fireplace, and a massive kitchen island. But the aesthetics were secondary to the tactical layout. Every room had a clear line of sight to an exit. "Lock the deadbolts," Mac instructed Uncle Rick. "Drop the steel shutters on the ground floor windows. I'm going to initiate the perimeter sensors." While Rick and Mac secured the perimeter, I collapsed onto a heavy wooden chair at the kitchen island, pulling my encrypted laptop from my go bag. I needed to reconnect to the TUC, Tactical Operations Center, and get a situational update. My mother walked over, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Are we safe here, Sarah?" I looked up at her tired, terrified face. "It's the best ground we could ask for. Mom, it's easily defensible. Mac and Rick are professionals. We just need to hold out for 36 hours until Colonel Miller can deploy a sterile exfil team to pull us out." 36 hours, she repeated, a hollow ring to her voice. "Hey," I said gently, covering her hand with mine. "We're going to be okay." A loud, metallic clang echoed through the cabin as Rick dropped the last heavy shutter over the living room window. The cabin was instantly plunged into twilight, illuminated only by the warm yellow glow of the solar-powered tactical lights on the ceiling. Mac walked into the kitchen, his face grim. "Motion sensors are live. Thermal cameras on the tree line are operational. If a deer walks within 500 yards of this place, we'll know it." "Good," I said, opening my laptop. Then, something caught my eye. Aunt Susan was sitting on the far end of the leather couch. She had her overnight bag unzipped, and she was frantically tapping on a glowing screen. The color drained from my face entirely. "Susan," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the room like a gunshot. "What is in your hand?" She jumped, instinctively pulling the device to her chest like a guilty child. It's just my iPad. I was trying to check my emails. I run a business. Sarah, I can't just disappear off the face of the earth." "I told you to strip the batteries," Uncle Rick roared, storming across the room. "I explicitly told you to leave all electronics in Tahoe." "I put it on airplane mode," Susan cried defensively, shrinking back against the cushions. "It's just connected to the cellular data. I swear I didn't turn on the GPS." I felt my blood run completely cold. It felt like the floor had just dropped out from beneath me. "Airplane mode doesn't stop a dedicated signals intelligence scraper," I said, standing up, ignoring the agonizing spike of pain in my side. I walked toward her, my eyes locked onto the glowing Apple logo on the back of the device. "If it is connected to a cellular tower, it is pinging a node. And if the proxy cell bought the metadata from a local telecom provider, they have a vector," Mac finished, his voice dropping into a register of absolute, terrifying calmness. "That's how they tracked us north. They weren't tracking the cars. They were tracking her." "Give it to me," I commanded, holding out my hand. Susan looked at my face and finally understood the magnitude of her mistake. She handed the tablet over, her hands shaking uncontrollably. I placed the iPad on the kitchen island. I didn't try to wipe it. I didn't try to power it down. I drew my Sig Sauer, aimed it directly at the center of the screen, and fired a single suppressed shot. Pfft! The tablet shattered into 1,000 pieces of glass and warped metal, the battery hissing as it died. My mother screamed, covering her ears. Brett flinched so hard he fell off his chair. "Too late," Mac said, staring at a monitor mounted on the wall near the fireplace. The monitor displayed the feeds from the external thermal cameras. The screen, which had been completely clear a minute ago, was now flashing with multiple red thermal signatures. "Movement in the tree line," Mac announced, racking the charging handle of his short-barreled rifle. The metallic clack-clack was the loudest sound in the world. "Northridge, 8, no, 12 heat signatures." They're bounding forward, using the trees for cover. They had found us. The digital leash had led the wolves right to the door. "Rick," I said, my voice shifting automatically into the cold, mechanical cadence of Omen 6. The pain vanished, replaced by the icy focus of imminent combat. "Take the family. Get them into the root cellar under the floorboards. Do not let them make a sound." "You got it, Captain," Rick said, drawing a heavy .45 caliber pistol from his hip. "Come on, Diane, Susan, move." "Wait!" Brett suddenly yelled, scrambling to his feet. He looked at me, his face pale, but a strange, desperate determination flickering in his eyes. I can help. Give me a gun." Mac barked a harsh, humorless laugh. "I have to do something," Brett pleaded, the guilt of his initial actions finally overpowering his cowardice. "This is my fault. The phone call. This is all happening because I was an arrogant prick." I stepped in front of him, looking him dead in the eye. "You want to help, Brett?" I asked, my voice deadly serious. "Yes." He nodded frantically. I reached into my vest and pulled out a heavy and blocky remote detonator with a flip-up safety switch. I shoved it into his chest. "The front driveway is rigged with directional claymore mines." I lied. There were no claymores, but I needed him focused and out of the way. "When I yell fire, you flip this switch and press the button. Do not press it before I tell you. Do you understand?" He gripped the remote like it was a holy relic. "I understand. Wait for the signal." "Get in the cellar," I ordered. He didn't argue. He turned and followed his father, helping his weeping mother and terrified aunt down a wooden ladder into the darkness beneath the floorboards. Rick pulled the heavy rug back over the trapdoor, leaving just me and Mac in the fortified living room. "Claymores?" Mac asked, raising an eyebrow. "Keeps his hands busy so he doesn't panic and scream," I replied, checking my spare magazines. "Smart." The cabin was silent, save for the howling of the Wyoming wind outside. Then, the first heavy, suppressed thud hit the front steel door. The attack didn't start with a scream or a hail of blind gunfire. It started with the cold, calculating precision of a professional hit squad. Theed. Theed. 2 suppressed rounds slammed into the reinforced ballistic glass of the single exposed window facing the porch, spiderwebbing the pane but failing to penetrate. They were testing our defenses, checking for weak points. "Thermal shows 3 on the front porch, 2 wrapping around to the eastern flank," Mac whispered, his eye pressed against the optic of his rifle, aiming through a narrow firing slit in the heavy wooden door. "The rest are holding the tree line to provide covering fire." "They have night vision," I noted, watching the feed on the monitor. "They're moving too fluidly in the dark." "So do we," Mac growled. He reached up and flipped a heavy breaker switch on the wall. Instantly, the interior tactical lights died. The cabin was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. I pulled my panoramic night vision goggles down from my helmet, hitting the power button. The world swam into a crisp, green-hued relief. Beside me, Mac did the same. We were no longer fighting blind. We were fighting on our terms. "I'll take the front door and the eastern flank," Mac said quietly, his rifle leveled at the door. "Captain, you hold the rear hallway and the kitchen windows. If they breach, we fall back to the cellar choke point." "Copy," I breathed, moving silently across the hardwood floor toward the back of the house. Every step was a calculated risk. The pain in my ribs was a dull roar, but I pushed it down into a dark box in my mind, locking it away. My combat breathing took over, in through the nose, out through the mouth. I reached the kitchen. The steel shutters were drawn, but there were 2-inch firing slits cut into the metal at chest height. I pressed my back against the wall, leveling my Sig Sauer at the gap. Silence. The heavy, oppressive silence of the deep woods. Then, I heard it. The faint, metallic scrape of a boot on the rear wooden deck. They had bypassed the thermal sensors on the back ridge. They had sent a team up the cliff face. 1, 2, 3 sets of footsteps. I held my breath. A shadow eclipsed the firing slit. Someone was looking through, trying to spot movement in the pitch-black kitchen. I didn't hesitate. I didn't issue a warning. I pushed the barrel of my suppressed pistol directly through the slit, placing it inches from the shadow's chest, and pulled the trigger twice. Pfft, pfft. A heavy, wet grunt echoed from the deck, followed by the sound of a body collapsing onto the wooden planks. "Contact rear," I called out, my voice tight. Hell broke loose. The element on the back deck, realizing they had lost the element of surprise, opened fire. A torrent of suppressed automatic fire raked across the back of the cabin. The heavy timber absorbed most of it, but several rounds found the firing slits, snapping through the kitchen and burying themselves into the drywall with violent cracks. I dropped to a crouch, wood splinters raining down on my helmet. Simultaneously, a massive explosion rocked the front of the house. They had brought breaching charges. "Front door is holding, but the frame is buckling," Mac roared over the ringing in our ears, unleashing a sustained burst of return fire through the door slit. "They're trying to swarm the porch." I crawled across the kitchen floor, glass and debris crunching under my boots. I needed an angle on the back deck. I reached the corner of the heavy oak island and peeked around. The back door was a heavy steel security door, but it was glowing with a harsh, white light. Thermite. They were burning through the locking mechanism. The steel was melting, dripping onto the floorboards like liquid lava. "Mac, they're burning the rear door," I yelled. "Hold the line. Captain, I'm pinned down by heavy suppression from the tree line." I checked my magazine. 14 rounds. I took a deep breath, fighting the agonizing protest of my ribs, and stood up, bracing my weapon on the countertop. The thermite charge burned out, and a heavy boot kicked the glowing, weakened steel door inward. It crashed open, letting the freezing mountain wind and the acrid smell of burning metal into the kitchen. 2 men in tactical black gear, wearing heavy night vision optics, poured through the doorway. Suppressed submachine guns raised. I fired. 2 rounds center mass on the first man. He dropped like a stone. The second man pivoted faster than I anticipated, bringing his weapon to bear. I threw myself sideways behind the kitchen island, just as a burst of 9mm rounds chewed through the space where my head had been. I hit the floor hard. Searing pain erupted from my cracked ribs, stealing my breath. My vision whited out for a terrifying fraction of a second. I lay on the floor, gasping, my gun arm pinned awkwardly beneath me. I could hear the heavy boots of the second attacker slowly circling the kitchen island. He knew I was hit. He was taking his time. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move my arm. "This is it," a dark voice whispered in my mind. "The ghost finally gets caught in the light." The attacker stepped around the corner of the island. Through my green-tinted vision, I saw him raise his weapon, aiming directly down at me. Suddenly, a loud, panicked voice echoed from beneath the floorboards. "Sarah! Fire! Fire! I'm pressing it!" Brett. The attacker flinched, startled by the sudden, screaming voice coming from the floor. He hesitated for half a second, his weapon dipping slightly as he looked toward the sound. It was the only opening I needed. Ignoring the white-hot agony in my chest, I rolled onto my back, brought my pistol up with my left hand, and fired 3 rounds straight up. The attacker jolted backward, his weapon discharging harmlessly into the ceiling, before collapsing backward onto the floor. Dead. I let my head fall back onto the wood, my chest heaving. "Good boy." "Brett," I whispered into the darkness. "Clear rear," I shouted hoarsely. "Front is clear. They're falling back to the tree line," Mac yelled back. "They took too many casualties. They're breaking contact." I lay there in the dark, listening to the fading sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. The proxy cell had underestimated their target. They thought they were hunting a frightened civilian and a retired old man. They didn't realize they had walked directly into a meat grinder. The silence returned to the cabin, heavier and colder than before. The smell of cordite and copper filled the air. I slowly pulled myself up, leaning heavily against the bullet-riddled kitchen island. My ribs were screaming, and I was bleeding again, but I was alive. The trap door in the living room slowly pushed open. Uncle Rick emerged first and sweeping the room with his .45 before waving the rest up. Brett crawled out, his hands shaking so violently he dropped the plastic remote detonator on the floor. He looked at the bodies in the kitchen, the blood pooling on the hardwood, and then looked at me. There was no arrogance left in him. There was no ego. There was only the raw, unfiltered realization of what true violence looked like, and the terrible price paid by those who stand in its way. "You did good, Brett," I said softly, holstering my weapon. "You kept your head." He stared at me, tears streaming down his face, and simply nodded. Mac walked into the kitchen, kicking the weapon away from the dead attacker. He looked at me, a grim smile hidden beneath his beard. 32 hours left, Captain," Mac said, pulling a fresh magazine from his vest. "Better patch those ribs. I don't think they're quite done with us yet." The aftermath of the breach was a masterclass in organized chaos. While Uncle Rick pulled the family out of the root cellar and corralled them into the safest, most reinforced corner of the cabin. Mac and I went to work on the bodies. I knelt beside the man I had dropped in the kitchen, gritting my teeth as my mother tightly wrapped a fresh layer of combat tape around my bleeding torso. "I'm sorry, Mom," I whispered, watching her hands tremble as she secured the gauze. "Don't," she replied fiercely, tying it off with surprising strength. "You keep us alive, I'll patch the holes. That's the deal." I gave her a weary nod and turned my attention to the mercenary. I stripped his tactical vest, pulling his spare magazines and tossing them to Mac, who was cross-loading the 9mm ammunition into our empty Sig Sauer mags. Then, I saw it. I pulled back the sleeve of the dead man's black combat shirt. Burned into the skin of his right forearm was a faded ink tattoo, a stylized, two-headed eagle clutching a sword. "Mac," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "Look at this." Mac walked over, his heavy boots crunching on the shattered glass. He looked down at the ink, and the color drained from his face. "That's not a Syrian proxy," Mac whispered, his jaw tightening. "That's a specific PMC offshoot, Directorate K, Russian Shadow Ops." They outsourced the hit, I realized, the horrifying puzzle pieces clicking together. The Syrians didn't have the assets on the West Coast to mobilize this fast. They paid a Russian wetwork team operating domestically to wipe the board, which means they aren't going to just lick their wounds and go home, Uncle Rick said, stepping into the kitchen, his .45 lowered but ready. If it's a Directorate K contract, they get paid on confirmation of the kill. They'll throw everything they have at us until the job is done. As if on cue, the dead man's tactical radio, clipped to his shoulder harness, crackled to life. A harsh voice spoke in rapid, encrypted Russian. I didn't speak fluent Russian, but my time in the activity required me to know the tactical brevity codes. I recognized 3 words: heavy, breach, dawn. They're bringing up heavy ordnance, I translated, a cold dread pooling in my stomach. They realize small arms won't break the cabin. They're waiting for first light to hit us with RPGs or mortars. We don't have 32 hours. Mac, we have 3. A heavy silence fell over the room. 3 hours. Can your colonel get a bird here? Rick asked, looking at me. I'll try, I said. I limped over to the kitchen island, opening my encrypted laptop. The screen glowed harshly in the darkened cabin. I typed in my authentication codes, bypassing the standard talk operator and initiating a direct, flash-override priority line to Colonel Miller. The screen blinked, and Miller's face appeared. He was no longer in his office. He was in a dimly lit SIF, surrounded by monitors. Omen 6, we tracked a massive spike in localized cellular traffic near your grid, Miller said immediately. You have a hornet's nest on your roof. Directorate K hit squad. Boss, I reported flatly. They outsourced the contract. We repelled the initial breach, but they are surrounding the perimeter and bringing up heavy ordnance for a dawn assault. We cannot hold this position for 32 hours. I need immediate extraction. Miller closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The political weight of the situation was crushing. Sarah, you are asking me to authorize a JSOC gunship strike on American soil. The bureaucratic fallout. I don't give a damn about the bureaucracy. Colonel, I snapped, the adrenaline and pain finally fraying my iron composure. My family is in this room. If you don't send a bird right now, we are going to die in this cabin. I am invoking the Broken Arrow Protocol. Our position is about to be overrun. Miller stared at me through the screen. He looked at the blood staining my shirt, the exhaustion in my eyes, and the sheer desperation of a ghost begging for a lifeline. Hold your ground, Omen 6, Miller said, his voice turning to steel. I have a quick reaction force at a black site in Utah. It's a 90-minute flight. I'm spinning up the Night Stalkers. 90 minutes, I repeated. We'll be here. Boss, Omen 6, going dark. I shut the laptop. 90 minutes. I told the room. Mac racked the charging handle of his rifle. Then we make them pay for every inch of ground for the next hour and a half. For the first 80 minutes, the cabin became an armed camp. Brett, completely devoid of his former arrogance, proved himself useful. Under Uncle Rick's strict supervision, Brett loaded magazines, distributed water, and stacked heavy oak furniture against the compromised rear door. Here, Brett said, handing me a fully loaded 9mm magazine. His hands were steady. He looked at the blood on my side, then up to my eyes. I'm sorry, Sarah, for everything. Keep loading, Brett, I said softly, taking the magazine. We'll do apologies if we live. At exactly 05:15 hours, the first light of dawn began to bleed over the Wyoming mountains, painting the sky in pale shades of gray and violet. And from the tree line, the distinctive, terrifying thwump of a mortar tube echoed through the canyon. Incoming! Get down! Mac roared. The first mortar shell slammed into the reinforced roof of the cabin. The detonation was deafening, a concussive wave of kinetic force that shook the entire structure. Dust and splinters rained down from the timber ceiling. Aunt Susan screamed, burying her face in Uncle Rick's chest. The roof will hold for 3 or 4 more hits, but not a sustained barrage, Rick yelled over the ringing in our ears. We have to suppress that mortar team. I've got it, Mac yelled, moving to the shattered front window. He raised his rifle, aiming through his optic at the distant tree line, searching for the muzzle flash. Thwump. A second shell hit the earth just outside the front porch, blowing a massive crater in the dirt and sending a shower of rocks clattering against the steel shutters. Suddenly, The tree line erupted in a hail of automatic gunfire. The Directorate K mercenaries were bounding forward, using the mortar fire as cover to close the distance. Sparks flew across the interior of the cabin as heavy caliber rounds chewed through the timber. I crawled to the kitchen firing slit, raising my Sig Sauer. I picked out a shadow moving between the pines and fired twice. The shadow dropped, but there were too many. They were swarming the property line. "We are Winchester on rifle ammo," Mac yelled, dropping an empty magazine onto the floor and drawing his sidearm. "Pistols only." We were out of time. We were out of bullets. "Rick, get them back in the cellar," I commanded, firing my last 3 rounds at an attacker sprinting toward the porch. "It's over, Sarah," Rick said grimly, standing over his family with his .45 raised, ready to make a final stand. I dropped my empty pistol. I looked at my mother, who was looking back at me with a terrifying, absolute acceptance. I looked at Brett, who was gripping a heavy kitchen knife, his jaw set. Thwump. A third mortar fired, but it never hit the cabin. Before the shell could reach the apex of its trajectory, a sound tore through the canyon that I will never, ever forget. It was the deep, rhythmic, mechanical roar of heavy rotor blades chopping through the thin mountain air. Suddenly, a massive, matte black MH-60 Black Hawk helicopter crested the ridge, banking hard over the cabin. It bore no tail numbers, no identifying insignia. It was the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. The Directorate K mercenaries looked up in absolute horror. "Get down!" I screamed. The door gunner on the Black Hawk opened fire. The M134 minigun, capable of firing 3,000 rounds a minute, unleashed a literal beam of tracer fire into the tree line. The sound wasn't a series of gunshots. It was a continuous, deafening roar, like the sky itself was tearing in half. The tree line disintegrated. Pine trees were chopped to splinters. The mortar position was vaporized in a cloud of dust and high explosive impact. A second Black Hawk swooped in from the east, deploying a fast rope team of Tier 1 operators into the clearing. They hit the ground moving, heavily armed and moving with the terrifying synchronization of an apex predator pack. The firefight outside lasted exactly 45 seconds. Then, total silence returned to the canyon, broken only by the steady thumping of the helicopter rotors hovering above. A heavy knock rattled the remaining timber of the front door. "Omen 6. A muffled, synthesized voice called out from the porch. "This is Vanguard Actual. Open the door. Captain, your Uber is here." I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 3 days. My legs finally gave out, and I slumped against the kitchen island, clutching my bleeding ribs. Mac walked over, threw the deadbolts, and kicked the ruined door open. A towering operator in full tactical gear, wearing panoramic night vision and a balaclava, stepped into the cabin. He looked at Mac, then at Rick, and finally at me. "Miller sends his regards. Captain." Vanguard Actual said, "We have a sterile bird waiting to dust you and the package off to a secure facility." Uncle Rick helped my mother to her feet. Aunt Susan was completely catatonic, staring at the operators in silent shock. Brett walked over to me. He didn't say a word. He just extended his hand. I looked at it. I reached out and let him help me to my feet. He wrapped his arm around my uninjured side, supporting my weight as we walked out onto the ruined porch. The Wyoming sunrise was cresting the mountains, bathing the destruction in a brilliant, golden light. As we boarded the Black Hawk, leaving the shattered cabin and the bodies behind, I looked back at my family. They would never look at me the same way again. The illusion of the boring logistics clerk was dead. It buried under a mountain of brass casings and Russian mercenaries. The shadow war had come home, and it had burned everything to the ground. But as the helicopter banked into the sky, pulling us away from the carnage, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer fighting alone. When the veil drops, there's no putting it back up. Sarah risked everything to protect her family, proving that true warriors don't boast. They act when the world goes dark. If this explosive journey of betrayal, survival, and ultimate redemption got your adrenaline pumping, show your support. Like this video to honor the silent professionals keeping us safe. Share it with someone who loves a story where the arrogant finally get humbled, and hit subscribe so you never miss another intense tactical drama. Drop a comment below. What would your covert call sign be? And how would you have handled Brett?